Welcome to Being Human. I'm Steve Cuss, your host. Fellow human. Hey, we're in a series right now where whether we have guests or just a solo episode, we're focusing on the question, what do you think you need that you don't really need? My field is chronic anxiety as well as theology. I help people notice the kind of anxiety that's always generated from false belief or false need. Now, there are genuine anxieties that are based on something real, like trauma or acute anxiety. But what's really interesting in our relationships and in our faith is when it's our false needs that get in the way. And what they do is they block our awareness of God. They disconnect us from ourselves and disconnect us from our people. So what do you think you need that you don't really need? When I have guests on the show, I invite them into that question and we kick around sometimes even a case. And that's the case with my guest today. Before I introduce her, let's light a candle, because it might be that you can just take this moment to reflect on a false need. I mean, they're pesky, aren't they? Because they feel so real in the moment. You know, me famously with my people pleasing, or my need to know the answer, or my need to be there for others when they're hurting. These would just be some of my false needs. Even though I know them, and even though I can talk about them now, in the moment, they feel so real. You know, the false needs kind of present us a false gospel, and it's always doom. It's always like, oh man, if that thing happens, it's the end of the world. And so it's always the right time just to relax into God's presence. So as I light the candle, you can be handing over what you think you need that you don't really need. And here we go. Now, for those joining us on video, I'll be putting this candle during the interview just over on the shelf here. Let me move it now for us. That way, those of you catching us on video, you'll know where to look. Today's guest is Dr. Mandy Smith. Mandy's been a friend of mine for a number of years, fellow Aussie. It's always good to have another Aussie on the show. Mandy and her husband, Jamie, lived in the UK, where Jamie was completing his theological studies. And then they lived in North America for several years, where Jamie was a college professor, Mandy was a lead pastor. And then recently they went back to Australia. They now live in Queensland, where Mandy is the Reverend at St. Lucia Church in Brisbane. Mandy's the author of a number of books, Vulnerable Pastor. A couple of years ago, she wrote a fantastic book called Unfettered, and her most recent book, The Confessions of an Amateur Saint. Mandy is what I call a pastor artist. You know, we have a number of pastor scholars, and they're great. They're really needed in the church. Pastor shepherds. I see Mandy as a pastor artist. She has a way of seeing the world and a creativity and also a literal, fine artistic expression that I just think the world is in desperate need of. We're in dire need of beauty. So before we get to the interview with Mandy, I was watching Stephen Colbert the other night, and he had the Australian artist Nick Cave on as a guest. And I think Colbert is at his best when he's asking people about grief. And Nick Cave tragically has lost two of his sons, one of his sons when his son was 15, the other one when he was 31, both in tragic circumstances. And so Nick is acquainted with grief. He's not technically a follower of Jesus, but he does read the Bible regularly. He's fascinated by God. He's definitely on a spiritual quest. And in the course of talking to Colbert, Colbert asked him about his practice of answering fan mail. For those of you not familiar with Nick Cave, he runs a blog where people send in fairly deep questions, and he will actually write long answers to their questions. And a lady had written about grief and asked him how he could possibly find any hope in the midst of despair. I'm going to read for you just a portion of what Nick Cave said as we set up our interview today. Cave says, "Hopefulness is not a neutral position. It is adversarial. It is the warrior emotion that can lay waste to cynicism. Each redemptive or loving act, as small as you like, such as reading to your little boy or showing him a thing you love or singing him a song or putting on his shoes keeps the devil down in the hole. It says the world and its inhabitants have value and are worth defending. It says the world is worth believing in. And of course, as a follower of Jesus, I would simply add to that a loving God is worth believing in. A sovereign Jesus Christ who is with us now is worth believing in. All right, here's my interview with Mandy. Okay, Mandy, let's get right to it. Why does the world need more Australians in their life?
I love that. Oh my goodness. Well, we just think about things in, I don't want to say different ways because according to our way, it's the normal way. But there are certain ways you just have to manage in this part of the world that require you to come at things from other angles than maybe the Northern Hemisphere does. So, yeah, and that's really true within the church too.
You spent, a quarter century ministering in the US?
Yep, we're in the UK for some of that and in the US for most of that. So, yeah, so I've been in a few different spots, but glad to be back home in Australia now.
Yeah, and then you recreationally moved back home through COVID.
Yes, I would not suggest anybody make an international move during a global pandemic. It was very complicated and expensive, but we're here now.
Yeah. So we've got a global audience on this podcast, but the majority of our audience are North American. Well, give us a couple of things that you first noticed when you went home. Like, it must be wild, right? Like, you were born and raised Aussie. You've lived much of your adult life in the UK and US. You come back home. Is it like a haunting familiarity? What was that like, first of all?
It was a strange feeling because my hometown of Brisbane also has changed significantly since I lived here last. But I wanted almost to have a word that was the opposite of grief because I had been gone for so long I wasn't sure if I'd ever live here again. And there were certain things that I had just lost, many, many things that I had just lost. And to hear a bird, like there were moments where I was just in tears suddenly to hear a certain bird song that I hadn't heard for such a long time that brought up all these memories from childhood. And so it was like the opposite of how grief hits you in a way that is so sad when you've lost something. This was the opposite of that is, like, oh, I've regained something that I thought I'd never have again. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, sentimentality doesn't quite get to it. Doesn't quite have the weight to it, but it is like a familiarity and a comfort.
There's it just showed me how our bodies are just connected to the places where they are and the smells and the sounds, even the feel of the air is different in each place. And it actually takes me a while when I've moved to different countries, it takes me a while to find God in that place. I know he's with me, but there are certain places and atmospheres that help me connect with God in different places. And it takes a while for me to find those again when I've moved, yeah.
It's an interesting idea. People talk about a thin place. I haven't heard anybody, until you just mentioned it, I've never heard anybody connect that idea of the accessibility of God connected to childhood familiarity. But as soon as you said it, Mandy, my brain immediately went to Cottesloe Beach. Like, I'm listening to you and I'm on Cottesloe Beach as an adult recently, flooded with experiences of God because I've spent so much of my childhood.
Yes. I have that experience when I read Narnia Chronicles again as well because, some of them I have not read since I was a child, and suddenly I am just reading that as a child again, and I think that's where I got some of my first theology is from some of those books, and so understanding God and loving God as a child again suddenly, I think lots of Narnia Chronicle fans can probably relate to that.
Yeah. Okay, so for my North American audience, it's an election year. You've probably heard the news.
Yes, we have heard a few whispers about such things.
Yeah. Give us your thoughts now that you're back in the motherland. Give us your thoughts about how Christians in America can navigate politics with their soul intact.
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. I did find, it makes sense that if the cycle in the US takes 2 years, the whole preparing for an election business takes 2 years, then 50% of the time you're preparing for an election. And so that's that's forming us. I'm also in the US, I'm a dual citizen. So I'll be voting in this election too. And it's just good to be aware of how we are formed by the language, we're discipled in a way as political creatures. And it's okay to care about those things. In fact, I think Christians should care about the issues and how they affect, especially those who might not have a voice. But are we more influenced by the thing that never changes and longing for the kingdom in that? That's a simple way of saying a very complex thing. But yeah, it's. I remember when I was preaching there in the US, I found it really challenging because if you say anything that sounds even slightly political, I felt like, I'm like a vehicle going in this direction with my sermon. And then if I ever crossed any of the kind of political ruts, there are deep ruts, that related to any justice issue. If you use the word justice, if you use some really scriptural words, if we've been shaped more by politics than by scripture, then as soon as a sermon, for example, goes anywhere near those concepts, suddenly we're thinking of them in terms of liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, and it really is an opening of our imaginations to be first primarily influenced by the kingdom and scripture, and then bring that to politics instead of the other way around. But I realize that's a very simplistic kind of thing to say.
No, I actually thought that was really poignant. I think the vision of the deep ruts is really helpful for a pastor listening to this or watching this, because it does feel like, Mandy, once we start to use gospel words that are also political words, so many of our congregation are no longer able to hear the gospel part of it.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, we almost need to redefine or draw it back to the earlier definition, the truer definition. That's not just, sound bites and clickbait.
Yeah, and of course, hopefully a good chunk of the congregation are able to hear gospel words, but there's a part of the congregation that now can no longer hear you. They're now measuring you,
exactly.
I think, as a pastor.
Yeah, and now they're just deciding, are they a liberal or are they a conservative? Can I trust them or can't I? And so it's shaped our imaginations. And we always joked that it was like aligning with your teams. And then when I was there recently I think it was Dallas Airport, there was a display in one of the gift shops in the airport that was literally set up like team paraphernalia, all the mascots, and there was a big sign and it had a donkey fighting an elephant, and it said choose your team, and then there was all this gear that was just like if it was, some sports team or whatever. And I was like, yep, see, I told you, it really is like this is our tribe, this is our team, and we're going to fight until our team wins, kind of thing,
Man. Well, let's get into your latest book. My long-term listeners know I've been a fan and a promoter of your work for several years now. For those who are newer to this show, this might be your first time meeting Mandy. Mandy is a pastor, but she's also an artist. I personally call you a pastor artist. I don't know if that's how you would identify yourself. I just know you're a rare breed. Like, you're kind of an endangered species. There's not many pastor artists doing public work, but you're one of them. I feel like 2024, we are in desperate need of artists more than ever. Tell us a bit about how you bring an artistic approach to your faith and to your vocation. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's something I actually feel the Lord inviting me to explore even more deeply. And I think there's a part of me that's a little bit worried that I'm going to do something that is just not accessible to everybody. I never, ever want to do anything in my writing or my speaking or congregational ministry that is only for artists. But it's healing for me to think that I can bring my true self, which includes my artistic parts, that sounds weird, but you know what I mean, that will actually be a blessing to the whole congregation and not just for the people who get art or whatever. So I think that there's actually just an approach I've just written an article for Missio Alliance that was kind of became a manifesto for me of how artists are actually can be really good leaders. And for a long time, I felt like, if I'm not a business-minded person, then I can't be a good leader. But there's a way that being an artist requires you to actually kind of acknowledge that you're not totally in control. Your media and the kind of creative inspiration, you're partnering with these other things. And so it's this kind of exploratory, experimental, risk-taking, watching and responding kind of process that most art making involves. And that's also a really great experience for knowing how to follow God and leading in a way that it may not cast a 5-year vision. It may say, what if we could be this kind of a place? And how can we pray and dream about this kind of a place or this kind of a mission? And so listening then to a whole community of people and listening to how the Spirit is stirring in them. And when I was a kid, I would love to just have a creative idea. Let's make this thing, or let's write this song together or whatever, and then get a bunch of friends together to do this creative project together. And everybody's bringing something different, and it becomes something even better than I could have been by myself. And in many ways, that's what leading a church feels like to me, is I'm like, I don't know exactly what this is going to be. I have a taste of something. Oftentimes artists have a general sense of what's going to happen, and then it becomes something bigger than they thought. And that can be scary, especially if people are like, but tell me what it's going to be, and I'm like, I don't know, come and do it with me and we'll figure it out together. Like, I realized that can be scary for everybody involved, including me. But it's really beautiful, because just like an artist can say, it's crazy how many times a writer will say, well, that character wrote themselves. I wasn't even planning on that character. Like, there's something going on that even people who wouldn't call themselves Christians acknowledge in the creative experience. And so there's this worshipful experience that happens when we're like, well, we started something and together we brought our gifts, and it became this thing that was so much better than we expected because there was this other force involved. And so yeah, I'm trying to learn and just embrace the fact that is a leadership gift, and actually that there are ways that sharing the actual art, like this book does have some of my art in it, that usually is just what I'm making to help me put things into words. I can be really, like, I'm an instinctive kind of person, and I just know things, but I can't put them in words yet. And I often will make something, and then it's like an extra step. I can make a thing, and then I can describe the thing. And now I've been able to put this instinct into words. And so the art is being published alongside of my words there, because they were a part of my process of shaping the words and figuring things out. So yeah, it's a work in progress. I'll get back to you on what it means to be a leader who's an artist. But I do see God doing a renewing work in so many of my artist friends. And I do believe that, throughout history, we've often seen a renewal in the arts, whether it's music or poetry or visual art or whatever. There's often a renewal in the arts when there's a church renewal. And so it gives me great hope to see so many beautiful things being created by Christians.
It's such a gift to someone like me, I think, Mandy, because I'm so cognitive. I think I'm technically what my therapist likes to call feelings repressed. And I'm like, your feelings repressed. That's usually my favorite reaction. But I tend to try to think my way to faith. Mm-hmm. I think many of us are like that. You and I are at least in North America, in the same network of churches. We are absurdly cognitive in our faith as a network of churches. And we need our artists, don't we? Because God is, at the end of the day, mystery, and systematic theology is not going to get us there. Well, like one more run through Romans is not going to get us there.
Yeah. And something amazing happens when I was just at an art exhibit recently, and I was thanking the artist because she paid attention to what the Spirit was stirring in her, and she made something from it. And that same Spirit stirs in me when I look at it. And I might not know exactly what was going on in her, but that's the power of art, whether it's music or poetry or visual art or whatever. And it's a risky thing for an artist to say, but this is too personal. How could it relate to anybody else if it's really coming from a really private place? It's just so subjective. But the best the best music we've ever listened to, it stirs something in us, even if we don't know that person's story, because we recognize in it a very human experience that we all share in common. And I do think that it sidesteps some of the rational arguments and doctrinal conversations that we want to have. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I've had some amazing conversations with people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. They wouldn't want me to have an argument or defend my faith in the usual way, but they are open to me sharing what was behind this painting that I made. And it's definitely to do with Jesus. And they'll hear that story when they wouldn't really want to sit down and have me share the gospel with them in the usual ways, So I think there's immense potential.
Yeah. So this is why I think everyone should be reading your books. The first book of yours that I read was The Vulnerable Pastor, just a beautifully written book, timely for me. Then Unfettered, still one of my favorite books of the power of childlike whimsy. Your most recent book, which is just about to come out, is Confessions of an Amateur Saint.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is a call to a way of Christian leadership. Tell us the heart behind this book.
Yeah, I didn't set out to write a book. I just found that in a very challenging season of ministry, almost every morning, I woke up overwhelmed by all the things I couldn't fix and control and understand, and would go for a walk every morning, even though I just wanted to get on my computer and fix and control and understand. And every time when I came home from my walk, there was something I needed to confess to the Lord. And I've never been the kind of person who does all the juicy vices. I've felt a little bit on the outside sometimes with, especially at youth group, where it was you know how you do all these horrible sins. But my greatest sin is just disconnecting from God when I'm feeling desperate, which is a lot of the time, in ministry, especially at this time in the church's life. We're all a bit in over our heads. There's so much in transition in the culture and in the church that there's not going to be just this kind of cruising of we're just maintaining something. We're always reimagining something. We're helping to repair baggage, and it's a crazy time. So every morning I would come in and I would just type away like crazy, the kind of journaling, just a personal journaling of my own confessions to the Lord, confessing how a particular situation in my life that day was tempting me to turn from God, not in any really obvious way, just in a way that was kind of secular, of trying to be professional and fix it in my own strength and understand it in my own ways. And so it's kind of a twofold confession, a confession of my stepping away from God, my disconnecting from God, and a confession of faith again, of saying, I will turn to you, I will trust in you in this. And after maybe 50 of those, I realized and I think I shared them with somebody, and they were like, this is actually really helpful to see behind the scenes of those moment by moment decisions that a pastor has to wrestle with, where I think this is where our integrity comes from as leaders, that we have, and you do a lot of this work too, just confronting the stuff, our own stuff, so that we, as much as possible, don't bring it into our leadership. So that because I've done that in the morning on my walk, when I'm in the middle of a meeting later on that day, and it's that sinking feeling again of I can't fix and control and understand, I've practiced privately, this is the moment we turn to God, So yeah, after a while I realized, this might be a blessing to other people. Not that my story is especially special, but maybe that's what makes it helpful, is because it's ordinary. And we see all the horrible headlines of choices that Christian leaders make, and it's easy to think, well, I would never do that. I'd never embezzle the church funds or have an affair or whatever, split the church. But I think it's really good for us to be aware of those very sacred, ordinary moments on a Tuesday when the sermon isn't coming together, or on a Wednesday afternoon when somebody just doesn't like us. And those little moments of choice that we have of, I'm going to just force something here. I'm going to try to be strong. I'm going to try to look professional in the world's definition of professionalism, which is usually being self-sufficient. Or I'm going to say, what I actually need right now is not the quick fix, not the answer that I think I need. What I need right now is the presence of the living God. And I'm going to choose to do that myself, and I'm going to choose to invite others to turn with me to him. So yeah, then it started to become a book.
I think this is what makes this book so beautiful, is it it is written by a pastor for any follower of Jesus who wants to have some kind of encounter with God, wants to get off the, I guess, Mandy, I would call it the treadmill of more of the same and try harder.
Mm-hmm,
You know,
mm-hmm.
that's in my field, we call that the attempted solution. You know, if the problem is, oh, there's so much to do to help the church, then the attempted solution is, well, I'm just going to try harder and do more of the same.
Yeah.
This book, you really do invite us off that treadmill. But what I appreciate is you put us in the room with you where we get to see a human-sized pastor grappling with your vocation, with what's overwhelming about the role. But you also then give us ways that we too can practice confession. Let's just start with a couple of tangible things. What's it like for you when you have to preach and you're struggling to feel it, or you've had a rough week? Like, for example, when I was early on in my pastoring, I was so insecure about it, I would kind of confess it to my church before I'd start the sermon. I'd say something like, I'm paraphrasing, but I'd say something like, hey, folks, if you knew the kind of week I had, you'd understand what's about to happen. You know, like it was terrible.
Yeah.
What's it like for you when you've got some years under your belt, but that still happens? You've got to get up and share, but you're struggling.
Yeah. I mean, that's almost every Sunday, to be honest with you. Almost every week I have this sense of like, maybe this is the week I've got nothing to say. And the funny thing is that takes me to an anxious place where I just work really hard and my books pile up on my desk and I'm just trying to bring my strength to it. And I force myself to lie on the floor instead and listen to the Bible passage, because even the posture over the Bible of like, I am in control and this is my tool and I will use it to make myself feel better and make myself look professional. And this is why the amateur saint is there in the title of the book, is that as professional people, Christians, it's good to remember what we knew as amateurs, just to follow the Lord because we love him and not because it's our profession. And so I choose to take a posture of just receiving. I lie on the floor and I just kind of try to ground myself and just be aware of my body for a bit and say, I'm just a person. For some reason, saying that really helps me. Like, I'm not, before I was anything, I was just a person. And after my role has passed away, after everybody in my life has passed away, and I'm just back with the Lord, I'm just a person. I'm just a creature that God has made. And I'm just here trying to bring myself as much as I can, whatever I can contribute. It never feels like enough. But I lie on the floor and I listen to the Bible passage that I'm going to be preaching on, and I let it do its work in me first. And maybe this is partly where my creative experience comes in, the artistic experience comes in, that I know nothing good comes from anxiety, that there is a power that is beyond our power, that is the place where any good creativity comes from. And so because I've submitted to that, then I have somewhat of an even experimental, like, I can laugh at myself and be like, well, God's just going to have to really show up because I have no idea how to do this week. I don't feel like I have enough time. I don't understand this passage as much as I'd like. I'm not even sure if I'm feeling God's presence right now. And I've had to trust that God doesn't only show up in the preparation, that God also is available in the preaching. And there are times when, I never want to use that as an excuse to not prepare. Don't hear me saying that, any of the listeners who like to cut corners on their preparation.
Yes.
That there have been times, and it's remarkable how often somebody afterwards will be like, I really love that one point that you made, and I know that came to me in the moment. That wasn't in my notes, and that's the thing that people are remembering. This is just to tell a kind of funny story that, so I was associate pastor at University Christian Church there in Cincinnati, had never preached before, and the senior pastor calls on Saturday night at 10 p.m, stuck in an airport somewhere, and says, I'm not going to be home in time to preach tomorrow as planned, so would you preach? So that was my first sermon. 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, I find out I'm preaching in the morning. And the passage for that week was the loaves and the fishes. And actually it was I feel like it was a gift from God, because I had been reading that for something else that week anyway. So I had some time to think about the passage, and I was able on my first sermon to stand there with my hands empty and say, I actually can't preach. I actually don't know how to do this. I've never done this before. If there is a sermon coming from me right now, it is not my sermon. I'm bringing loaves and fishes, and if God is feeding the multitude, that's like, bear witness with me to this miracle right now, So I think somehow that was a good way to begin a preaching ministry in a way, yeah.
Okay, so Mandy's latest book is Confessions of an Amateur Saint. And we're going to move into the second part of the pod, Mandy, where we're helping our listeners come to terms with their own false needs. So I love what you mentioned earlier. You said nothing good comes from anxiety. As I was hearing you say that, I thought, well, sometimes anxiety comes in handy. If you ever come across a tiger snake, for example, anxiety is very beneficial there. But there is a type of anxiety that's always based on a false need that feels real in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so insidious because in the moment, it's all instinctual. So I guess I'd start by simply asking you, would you share with us, like, what do you think you need in the moment that you don't really need to thrive?
I need people to like me or agree with me is one of the big ones, I think. And I just want to know, I need to understand what's happening here. I need to know the outcomes, where we're headed, why my efforts are going to be worth it, what they're going to become. I think those are two big ones for me.
So let's go back to your preaching, or maybe we'd like to call it Sunday morning public speaking, whatever we want to name it. I know in my life, after I preach a sermon, I feel pretty vulnerable. I think I'm pretty hopped up on adrenaline. So, okay, you're standing down the front. Have you had an experience where you can see someone coming down the aisle and just by their body language, your brain is saying, oh, this person's disappointed or angry? Have you had one of those situations?
Oh, yes, regularly.
What does your body or your mind tell you in that moment?
Yeah. I mean, of course, even right now I'm feeling a visceral, a physical response where your heart starts pounding a little bit and your stomach churns a little bit. But I am watching God do some healing work in me, because I have I'm in the middle of a what's called a regeneration work here in the Uniting Church, where the congregation almost closed 3 years ago, and now we find ourselves with around 60 folks, and just a new mix of younger people and a new kind of energy for mission, and it's exciting. But it means there's been a lot of change, and folks have not always liked that change, and so that's thrown me as a people pleaser into a difficult situation. But I think because of how I have had to process that privately, the things from that private processing come with me into the moments where I'm just thrown into the deep end suddenly after a sermon, like you just said. And, it is my job to be their pastor still, even if they're not happy with me. And so if I take it personally, that's not going to really serve them. And so it takes a lot of work and some, quick prayer there in the moment to just think, okay, what is actually happening in this person? How can I have compassion for them even though they're coming after me? I want to just protect myself, but there is something at the root of this that is probably worth paying attention to, even if they aren't saying it in a way that is easy for me to have compassion primarily, And so, and your work and Peter Steinke's work and Edwin Friedman's work has helped me kind of listen in a different way to people. And so that's really helpful. But I'm aware as I'm telling this that it often comes from the work that I'm doing privately of going back to the Lord and saying, who do you say I am again? And what have you asked me to do again? And who are you? It's refined. Every time there's someone who's unhappy with what you're doing, it does refine your call and it does refine your sense of identity. And the more that you do that, I've had the strange kind of gift of having to do that an awful lot, of upsetting people as much as I try not to. And so something of that comes with me into those moments of confrontation, where you've kind of practiced being grounded in who the Lord is and who you are. and trying not to lose touch with that.
I think you do bring a fresh voice and a fresh perspective. And it is surprising people like you feel very normal, and then it's surprising when what you say that feels normal to you can provoke people, right? Like I've run into that with a number of people who have a prophetic needed voice. They're like, I don't feel very prophetic. I feel very like standard. I'd like to explore again, I think this could help our listeners and our viewers. I'd like to explore, is there ever anything crazy you have done to get your false need? I'm happy to share an experience from my life. I'm a people pleaser like you, and I noticed a pattern in my life several years ago that if I would run into somebody that I hadn't seen in months or maybe years, we run into each other in some public setting. We're very thrilled to catch up. It's probably, honestly, a relationship where that was enough. You run into each other once in a while, you catch up for 20 minutes, you're good. But my brain says to me, they need more. And they will say inevitably, we should grab coffee sometime. They say it, not me.
Right.
And then my brain says to me, you must chase them down until you get coffee.
Yes.
That's crazy, Mandy. Like they didn't even mean it. They just didn't know how to say goodbye. So they kind of put that out there. And then I obligate myself and I'm emailing and texting, when are we going to get that coffee? Because in my mind, I would hate to be the friend that abandoned someone. It's nuts. So I've had to train my brain when someone says, we should grab coffee sometime, that I've had to stay, oh, yeah, feel free to reach out. Be happy to plan something.
Yeah.
Does that?
Absolutely. Just yesterday, I was making changes to an Airbnb reservation, and the lady finished by saying, yeah, all the changes are made. You're going to love this place. You can hear the beach from your bedroom or whatever. And I was like, can I just leave that now? Like, do I have to say, that sounds amazing or whatever, Like, that's a really tiny example. But I did get back on and say, that sounds amazing, because it did sound amazing. But I was conscious of it. I was aware of like, I actually don't have time to do this with every single interaction. But yeah, there is a way that you want to make sure that people feel seen. And I hear it. I do find myself doing that. I have learned with a few situations when somebody is seeking a meeting with me, especially if it's not somebody in my congregation, some extra meeting that they want to talk to me about something, networking or whatever. And I have learned to say, why don't you come to my church? Like, come meet me at a coffee shop near me. Because if they're the ones who want to meet, I don't want to be driving half an hour to their place, So little things like that, but it still feels, even saying it now, I'm like, oh my goodness, is that really selfish of me? Yeah.
I totally relate to that. Like, now that I've got a couple of books out in the pod, people reach out wanting to meet with me, and I'll meet with anybody. And sometimes if they're in Colorado, they're like an hour and a half away. And I have to remember, wait a minute, I drive anywhere to meet people I want to meet. Like, I'll happily, but I don't ever want to feel entitled or, okay, that's really good. Let's move on to the big five. This is another theme we're exploring right now, is every human being has up to 5 core false needs. Here we go. It's control, perfection, knowing, let me say it again, control, perfection, knowing the answer, being there for others when they're hurting, and approval. I think I can guess where you're at. What's your response there on those ones?
Well, I think the perfection is actually also a factor, and that can come into the approval thing, where like 100% of people must like me 100% of the time at 100% of like level, like, which is really a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. I even as I'm saying that, I'm joking, because I don't think I'm there anymore. But I had a moment just last year where, I am trying to bring some changes here, and I had a kind of sense of feeling a challenge from the Lord of saying, like, Mandy, you can, in this situation, you can please me or you can please that person. You're going to have to choose which one's it going to be. And of course, I know what I would like to say, but but there is a real cost, and it actually really, it really helps me to see that those are deaths that Jesus died to. Way before he died physically, he was dying to his desire, to the relational, social, wanting to be everyone to like him kinds of desires he had to die to as well. And that was a part of his sacrifice for us that makes the gospel good news even in those moments of death that we experience, that it's not just for when we physically die, that his sacrifice also covers those moments of death for us.
This is one of the reasons I love talking to you. I've never in my life thought about, like, Jesus calls us to die to self. I openly teach that we need to die to these very things. I've never thought of Jesus in his own development on earth, handing over his human desires. That's a stunning and beautiful thought. I couldn't tell if I heard control in some of your answers before. Do you feel like you relax when you are in control? You shared something earlier in the interview about going into a meeting and knowing the outcomes and the directions. That would tend to indicate someone that prefers.
Yeah, the control is probably a big one on the list that you just read too.
Yeah, I'm glad I brought it up.
Yeah.
I'm here to serve.
That's a perfectionist thing too, I think. So maybe it all comes down to perfection.
Yeah. So, Dr. Mandy Smith.
Yes.
You have been the only female lead pastor in an entire denomination. You have earned a doctorate under the great Win Collier at Western Seminary. You have been woken up by the sound of a kookaburra rather than an alarm clock. And yet, you have not yet successfully endured the gauntlet of anxiety questions here on the Being Human podcast.
I was getting anxious this morning, even thinking about what's he going to ask me? What's the gauntlet going to be? So
good.
I'll have as an introvert, I'll have the perfect answers tomorrow.
Yes.
But I'll do my best today.
As you well know, I'm not happy unless my guest is squirming. So
okay. All right. Let's go.
Yes. Let's look at this. So let's just start. I think we've got 3 or 4 here. What types of people, like personality traits, trigger you the most?
The kinds of people who are immature versions of me, or the person I'm trying not to be myself.
Okay. Which is what? What are they doing?
Actually related to the controlling stuff. Like there's a playful artist in me, but there's also the controlling perfectionist in me. And those two parts of me are always kind of battling. And I've felt the Lord in many, many ways over many, many years call me like, you're going to have to be more experimental, take more risks, improvise more. And there's freedom in that. But there's still this little voice in me that's like, you're not in control. You don't know what this is going to be, you know? And so if I have an actual person in the room who's literally saying, but what's it going to become? Tell me, I'm not going to follow you, or I'm not going to join in the experiment until you tell me what the outcomes are. I've already got that voice in my head, and it's really hard for me to also to be dampening the voice in my head and also be responding to it when it's in the room as well.
Oh, very good. Okay. So then related to this, you're aware of these people that tend to trigger you. I think the human response is to avoid those people or get frustrated at them. But of course, Jesus invites us to love our neighbor and our enemy, which is sometimes the same person. What have you found helpful to be able to still connect to that kind of person when you're triggered?
Yeah. I think it's always good, and your work is the kind that helps me think through this, to talk about what's happening on a different level, not just the surface level I'm reacting to what they're saying, but like, let's talk about what we need right now, and let's talk about discomfort, and to actually not maybe answer their question right away, but take some time to think, okay, let's read the room. Let's be conscious of why we think we need those things. Do we really need that? What would it look like to be uncomfortable here? And I haven't always done that well, but that's what I'd like to do.
Okay. Next gauntlet question. What's one way that you treat others that if you started treating yourself the same way, your life would be better?
Oh, goodness me. Just having all the grace, of seeing people trying their best and being able to say, but look at all the good that's come from that, and look at all the ways God is using that. And I'm not as good at doing that for myself.
Okay. This next question is a bit of a left field, and we can edit it out if it throws you too much, but
okay.
I find it to be fascinating. Tell us about the first time you saw a dead body.
Oh, goodness. Thankfully, I haven't seen very many dead bodies. Yeah, the very first time was actually when I was living in a really rough neighborhood in Cincinnati, and police were carrying somebody out of the apartment building across the road, and their hand kind of flopped. They were all covered, and their hand kind of flopped out from underneath the cover for a second. It was an older person who we just knew by sight, and there was just a different weight, to watch a hand flop. You can see, there's nobody controlling that hand anymore, Mind you, I say I don't see dead bodies very often, but I do funerals all the time. I mean, that feels different than seeing, when you say a dead body, I think like, oh, someone you've come across who's died. But yeah, I did have a moment just a few months ago where I was zipping around preparing for a ceremony, forgetting that it's a funeral, and walk out of my office and there's a dead body right there in my workplace, basically, which is the church. So yeah, I do see dead bodies all the time, I guess, with funerals, but yeah, nothing probably as dramatic as some people would say of the first time they saw a dead body.
Yeah, okay. Tell us about whose belly laugh you really enjoy and what makes them laugh hard.
Oh my goodness. My husband, Jamie, when he would travel, I remember my daughter even saying, I miss Dad's big laugh. He has this one like, ha, laugh like that when he's watching something hilarious on TV. And there's a couple of British comedy sketches that I know, like I really thought he might die one day when he was watching this one, that he could not catch a breath. He like fell on the floor and he could not stop laughing. And even to this day, if he ever even tries to describe that comedy sketch to anybody, he just cannot help himself. And it's a really lame, kind of funny sketch from a show called Big Train, where a man goes to visit his friend at his house and they're just having a normal, really casual chat in the backyard, drinking a beer or whatever. And the man whose house it is talking to his dog, and then the dog suddenly runs into the picture, and it's a man in a dog suit, like walking on his feet, running around, and the person is, the guest is like, what is going on here? So I'm not doing a very good job of describing it, but you can imagine that maybe you can't imagine. I probably haven't described it very well, but it's funny to watch him enjoy things like that.
Lovely. All right. Tell us about a time where you were the only one of your kind in a room.
Yeah. That happened a lot when I was in ministry in the US, and my church was kind of in an evangelical kind of circle. So oftentimes when I would go to conferences for pastors, they'd have a special meeting for lead pastors, and honestly, there were times where people assumed I was there to take the minutes, which there's nothing wrong with. I have been a secretary and I have taken the minutes, but that was not my role in that particular room. And and then there's been times when, even out of good intentions, people have been aware, oh, our board doesn't have any women on it, let's get a woman on the board. And in some ways that's harder than when people don't welcome you, when you're a token person representing your whole gender. It can kind of feel like they've said, we've decided what the menu's going to be. Will you bring the mashed potatoes? And I'm like, I don't actually make mashed potatoes. Can we go back to the discussion about what's the menu? and I can help actually shape what we're doing here and not just bring a piece that fits what you've already decided. I've been in that situation often too.
My working thesis on this, I'd like to get your take on this because it's totally a subjective opinion. My working thesis is, in any given room, you need at least 3 of your kind so you can relax and be yourself. How does that, and I think if it was a room of 500, that doesn't count. But I'm talking about your average boardroom where there's, 10 to 15 people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would help. That would help. Yeah, I've been in rooms like that where there's been 2 or 3 other women in a group of, 12 people. And you do find yourself looking at each other. And you kind of just not know. And I've seen African Americans do that. I've seen, people of color people with disabilities, there are probably plenty of ways that I'm the one who's making other people feel like a minority too.
Yeah. Okay. You have sailed through the gauntlet. We have one last question.
Okay.
When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
I've had a couple of really beautiful moments that I've never had this before, all three related to at moments of creating something where I just made something, and I don't know if it was good in anybody else's eyes, but it was just what I wanted it to be. I was writing a description of walking and listening to the birds, and around here we have such beautiful, really loud bird songs. And so I was telling the story in my writing of just stopping to name the birds. And I just said, butcher bird, full stop, kookaburra, full stop, cockatoo. And something about those three bird names in that order, I was delighting in the memory of listening to those sounds. And I was also delighting in just the sound of those words, butcherbird, kookaburra, cockatoo. It's onomatopoetic. And I just was enjoying it, even if nobody else reads it right now, whatever. And then I felt the Lord being like, yeah, that's like delighting in it with me. And then I thought, and maybe somebody else will read it one day and they'll delight in it too. There was just, I feel like that's what Eden is. And that's what heaven will be, is like us living out our fullness, without worrying about what everybody else thinks, just being truly ourselves in a beautiful childlike state and feeling God's delight in it with us and thinking, and maybe that will delight somebody else. I mean, is there anything better than that? So I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I love that. Friends, my guest has been the Reverend Dr. Mandy Smith. She's the pastor at St. Lucia Church in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. She's a doctor. She's a pastor, artist, and author of multiple books. Her most recent, The Confessions of an Amateur Saint. Mandy's a part of the Missio Alliance and has written and spoken extensively for them. She's written for our very own Christianity Today and more. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes for those who want to chase her work. You'll be better off for doing it. Mandy, thanks so much for joining us on Being Human.
Yeah, it's always so good to catch up with you, Steve.